The Canvas Series, Episode 13. Hey everybody, it's Raf here, and welcome back to another episode of the Canvas Series, a podcast about up-and-coming entrepreneurs and creators and how they're designing their life to build momentum and get results. So this is a very special episode as we're collaborating with Marc Champagne, host of the Keo Conversation podcast and co-founder of Keo, a daily self-reflection app that is absolutely rocking the wellness category right now. So when Marc and I first connected, we clicked immediately on our self-reflection practice, sharing different ideas and strategies and what's worked and what hasn't. And both of our fascination really stems from studying world-class people, such as best-selling author and entrepreneur Tim Ferriss or hedge fund billionaire Ray Dalio. And every one of these individuals who performs at that caliber all has some form of self-reflection practice. And one thing we often don't realize is that every one of us is doing it as well, whether we consciously know it or not. And what really separates the pack is that deliberate act of pausing, thinking, and reflecting on what matters most. So without further ado, please enjoy this episode and do me a favor, take a screenshot of the episode and share it on social media. Both Marc and I are really looking to share this timeless tool and practice with as many people as possible because it has absolutely made a difference in our life and we are confident it will do the same for you. So please enjoy and have a great day.
Nice.
All right, so welcome everyone to a very special episode where we're doing a collaboration between Keo Conversations, hosted by Marc Champagne, and the Canvas Series, hosted by myself, Raphael Wong. And, this is a very special episode for both Marc and I because not only are we having a great conversation between two amazing shows with very similar missions and audiences, but more importantly, what we're about to talk about, right? Both Marc and I first connected and we really dug deep into our individual mindfulness and reflection practices, and both of us agree that in today's world with information and choice overload and all the noise and distractions going on, why having a reflection practice is so important, not just from a performance perspective or from a focus and clarity perspective, but just overall like our own well-being. So really excited to kick this off, and to fire things up, I'm gonna take a question from your book. So Marc, who are you and what's your story?
Great question, and first of all, thanks for having me on the Canvas Series as well. And anytime I get to talk about modern day reflection, it makes me happy because I think more of us need to be talking about it so that people can benefit from these tools, right? These tools have been around forever, so it's time we talk about them a little bit more. So who am I? I'm an individual that really strives to just connect and connect authentically with people, my surroundings, I would say, and really everything that I'm seeing kind of day in and day out. Like that is my ultimate mission is to really try to pull out the happiness of each day, and kind of hence the name Keo, which is the Japanese word for today. Like how can we get the most out of today? I'm a firm believer. I think we learn from our past. We can dream about our future, but we really need to live right now, for example, right? Like we're here, we're having this awesome conversation, and let's be in it, right?
I love that.
So yeah, so that's me. That's the first time I've been asked that, so it's a decent answer because I stump everyone else on our show with that one. So
fair enough. So and then I suppose for everyone listening, from the Keo Conversation side, a little bit about myself. I think if I were to describe myself, I would really say that I am an adventurer at heart. I think both of us like traveling. So whether it's, a geographic in terms of traveling, whether it is exploring new technologies or products or businesses, or just exploring human potential. And that's something that really drove me to start the Canvas Series and everything I do. It's really understanding how can I take information, how can I take systems and technologies and things, and how do I take theories and how do I bring it together to ultimately do more, to be more intentional, to build more momentum, to create more value and impact both for yourself and the people around you. And I think, both you and I have that kind of shared mission in that regard.
Yeah. Well, I just remember our first conversation together. I think we met through the local impact theory, or what's it called now? Toronto Impact
Theory meetup.
Yeah, meetup. And meeting after that, for coffee. And it was one of those situations where it was like, yes. I totally understand. I do that too. So I'm glad we can get together and talk about this. And hopefully it helps people, try to uncover their own systems or their own practices, because at the end of the day, you have to find something that works for you, right? I mean, I know we agree on the themes, but we have very different setups and practices, which I think is great.
For sure. So before we jump into the specific systems and strategies, let's kind of unpack mindfulness, right?
Sure.
What you're doing at Keo, you're really at the forefront of this space, and you're talking with some of the most, prominent thought leaders like Kevin Rose, Adam Grant, all these individuals who've maintained a mindfulness practice for a large portion of their life, and it's really driven a lot of their success. So, from your perspective, what is mindfulness, and how has that definition evolved over time?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of definitions of mindfulness out there, and because I asked that question on the show as well, and everyone's kind of got a different slant to it. So for me personally, it's really just being aware, and kind of how I described who I am. Essentially, I'm describing myself as a mindfulness person.
Mm-hmm.
And, that wasn't always the case. I think, it started probably 10 plus years ago when I really got into photography. And that was the first type of, let's call it a practice, or first hobby, let's say, that forced me to really see things in a different perspective. And, instead of just walking past an object or whatever it is, now I'm looking, okay, the light is really awesome. Right. The angles are there. There's a cool composition. So I have a little bit of a photographer's dilemma, which is how it's described. It's I can't ever go somewhere without seeing a photograph. I don't see that as a problem, actually. But sometimes people are like, yeah, how do you, just like designers are going through the typeface of menus at restaurants, right?
Mm-hmm.
If something's off, they just can't focus on anything else. But yeah, so for me, mindfulness is just, again, in whatever you're doing, just being present and being in that moment. Because there's so many different types of there's mindful eating, there's mindful meditation, there's mindful running. You put the word in front or behind any sentence, and there's a practice there, right?
Yeah.
What about you? How do you define it?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and if I were to really break it down into two categories, I think part mindfulness is your physical environment. So whether it's traveling, whether it's taking a different way to work, whether it's going to a new meetup in a new office space, there's that physical dimension where it's new to you. There's a sense of uncertainty, there's a sense of awe, there's a sense of oh my gosh, take this in. And if I were to think about the first tangible strategy for anyone is really to put yourself in new physical environments, right? I think people put a lot of pressure on themselves that they have to travel to be mindful. They need to be in these exotic places, and while that is true, I've got that same feeling when I run a different route, right? When I bike into a new part of town, right? So the physical dimension is really important. And I think the other dimension that's really important is also when you're doing things that you really care about, right? When you're kind of in a state of flow, when you're really in the moment, and it's something that really matters to you, I think that really triggers that desire to be present, whether it's closing a big deal, or I think it's in your past podcast you talked about how mindfulness has helped you in sales, and some of the work we've done in that regard, and how to be more present, as well as even for me, just from non-business related experiences. When I have dinner with my girlfriend, I want to be present, I want to be in the moment, I want to take in the restaurant, I want to take in the food, I want to enjoy the conversation. So that's really how I break down mindfulness. Is part external, your physical environment, in which case I would encourage people to put yourself in new physical environments, and then the things that matter to you, and just really to just double down and really understand the things that matter to you, and remove distraction, right? Hamza and I talked about in our last podcast episode, ever since I turned off notifications on my phone. I don't know if you do that.
Game changer.
Game changer. It's been amazing. It's helped me be so present in so many aspects of my life that
I shouldn't say I do have notifications, but I have notifications from Keo, from Headspace, like all the ones I want to have notifications from.
Right. So it's by choice.
Yeah. I want to touch on something you said about just, being mindful or present in the everyday life versus, we often strive to go on these really majestic, trips and stuff like that. And people can relate to that because that's when you're kind of disconnected from your everyday job.
Right.
And all of a sudden, like, wow, look at all this stuff around, like you're somewhere new and all of that, right? So, what I would encourage people is try to find that feeling where you live, right? And that's where you're saying like you're taking a different route and all that. And I only bring it up because, the last couple of years since leaving my job and then starting Keo, I mean, we really haven't traveled much. Like we've moved from Montreal to Toronto, so we call it. My wife and I was, we're going to live the city, and there's a lot to get to know in Toronto, thankfully. But we were the couple or the people that would go at least one or two times a year to like Europe or like something, outside of the country. Something grand, yeah. And, just starting a new business and having a new child and all of that kind of stuff and financial changes with one job to the next, like we just can't do it right now. So it's been a real exercise on my side and my family's to like, how can we get the most and find the happiness in every day, So I was chatting with one our team actually today. We have a weekly meeting every Monday, and just talking about how a lot of people like they work to get to the vacation, right? So if we can somehow help people, and there's nothing wrong with these vacations, but if we can somehow help people not have that feeling where they have to go on vacation, I think it will be a much happier society. I'm not saying you shouldn't take time. I think we should all take time, but it shouldn't be like the end all be all. Like we have to get to like in 2 weeks I'm going on vacation or I'm going to burn out.
Right.
It's kind of my point, right?
And building on your own personal mission, right, to really enjoy the moment and today. If you're constantly living for your vacation 6, 8 months, 10 months down the road, so does that imply you're not enjoying the next 6, 8, 10 months? Like that's a very unfortunate thing. And I think it does, I think it's a set of practices and systems that we can really design into our life to get that feeling now. Which brings us to really like the meat of today's discussion, which I think mindfulness is a lot of things we can do, as you mentioned, meditation and whatnot, but I want to focus today on journaling and the practice of reflection. So again, from your perspective, yes, being at the forefront, like I know, like I've heard you mention in the past that society's got this definition of what journaling is, right?
Yeah.
So I'd love
even when I hear the word, it makes me cringe a little bit.
Right? So what is society's definition, and then how do you define journaling or reflection?
Yeah. So I'll share a story about that because it's quite funny or ironic that you have these two polar opposite kind of perceptions, and the typical response I get if I use the word journaling is, oh, so you're talking about from older people. You're talking about, or people our age, I should say, talking about the 10-year-old girl writing her diary about the boy at school, which is nothing wrong with that, again. But no, that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. And then you have the complete other spectrum where I interviewed Haley Thompson, who I can't remember. Haley Thomas, sorry. I think she's 14 or she's 16 actually at the time. And we had that same conversation. She's like, that's really funny because all my friends think that journaling is for old people. So, like complete opposite spectrum. So that's why I don't like to talk about it in the sense of journaling because really what it is reflection.
Right.
And again, it's not like it's literally been around for thousands of years. So it's not like the practice needs to be proven. I mean, anyone that follows any type of stoicism, it's littered through that, right? Pick up any of Ryan Holiday's books and you'll see it there.
Right.
But So for me, I talk about it as reflective writing, or just general reflection. And it doesn't just have to be, it could be in an app, it could be in a notebook, it could be you just thinking, it could be you saying something out loud, it could be recording something. I think the key, again, this is my perspective, is that you're prioritizing a bit of time to think.
Yes.
And stop and like come out of that autopilot. Because that's what we've been pushed into as a general society. And I mean, it's starting to change, thankfully. Multitasking is no longer really seen as this big advantage. Like single tasking is kind of the hot thing right now, right? Yeah. So, as that stuff kind of continues, I think it'll help, but it's around us all the time. So we have to be conscious to try to pull out of that rat race or whatever, the autopilot, so that we can take some time to think.
And that's big, right? Like, a lot of people, whether it's Tim Ferriss, Ryan Holiday, a lot of the thought leaders have talked about the different benefits of a reflection practice. And something you said earlier about thinking, right? As I was thinking before this episode, really trying to think about, why do I reflect? Like, what do I get out of it? And the number one reason I would say for me, and not to say that like this one is the end all be all, but for me it's really around analyzing and thinking, like thinking about my day, my thoughts, my emotions, my decisions, my behaviors, how I respond to certain things, how do I conduct myself, how do I present myself in in different situations. This aspect of thinking and analysis is, for me at least, one of the most important benefits to my reflection practice, and it's really helped me do so much in terms of career pivots, in terms of starting this podcast, and in terms of helping others, and just doing everything I do. I think because every single day I take a moment and think about and I analyze my day, it gives me that sense of clarity. And then I think some of the other kinds of benefits are, helps me deload. I think Tim Ferriss says that a lot. I have all these thoughts, and because I'm more introverted in nature, I have a lot of thoughts in my head, and it's just a brain dump. It's just to put all the stuff in. And,
gotta get it out.
Right. And I think the last thing is the documenting thing, right? Like, if there's, like of all the crazy things that Gary Vee says, I think the aspect of documenting is such a home run for me. And like, I want to capture all these thoughts, and it could be, written on in my, like a physical journal. It can be put into like your app. It could be done through vlogs. It can be done through a little audio, a voice memo, but just documenting my thoughts and really capturing these moments. So I can look back one day and be like, oh, like that's how I thought. That's how the journey was. And I think as two individuals trying to build something here, this is an advantage we have that a lot of the modern day titans, they don't have, right? Like, Ray Dalio can write a book, his book Principles, but like it's very high level. Like, I bet if he had the chance to document it in the very beginning, he would have done it, right? So this is an advantage that we have, that which is a big reason why I reflect. But what about you? Like, what are some of the main reasons why you started a practice of reflection?
Well, first I just want to say, because you mentioned a lot of different names there, and that's why I've started kind of what we've started as a team, because it's not like 50% or 60 or 70% of the people that you just mentioned are doing some sort of reflection. 100% of them are. Mm-hmm. So, and that leads into kind of how I started. I started reflection or reflective writing, let's call it, probably about 10 years ago. And I first started a job in pharmaceutical sales. And, they have great sales training in those organizations. They have great medical training as well. And what was happening was, I was going through the process and whatnot, but then quite quickly it's like, well, everyone's going through this process, right? So if I want to have a chance to be the top in my territory, I've got to do something different. So I started getting up early, 5 or 5:30 or something, and that's when, and the family still kind of makes fun of me to this day, but like that's when it started. And what happened was that I was just trying to fuel my mind with positive things and like good reading. So like Robin Sharma was a go-to blog, Tony Robbins, Success Magazine with Darren Hardy, I believe is his name. Those were the go-tos at the time. And then Tim kind of started coming up, Tim Ferriss, and then it shifted into podcasts. And basically, there's like two systems. There's consuming and I still follow this: consuming information and then reflecting on it.
Right.
And that's where it started. And then fast forward to a couple of years ago, just again, like my go-to podcasts were Tim Ferriss, Chase Jarvis, and Kevin Rose. And just listening to those guys interview all of their guests over and over again, and like, man, every single one of them have really powerful questions that they're like the guests they're asking themselves throughout their whole journey. So I'd be writing these things down in like Apple Notes, and I'd be copying and pasting them into another app. I'm like,
can you walk me through that specifically? So like how was your pre-Keo system? Like what exactly was that setup?
I mean,
I'm very curious.
The very first setup was literally a Word doc.
Okay.
It was always digital.
Okay.
Because at that time, I was always traveling. So even in sales, like you're always in the car, your sales meetings, all this stuff. So, and I just didn't like the idea of having, like, I'm kind of a minimalist in a sense. And I didn't like the idea of having this like extra book to carry around, because I didn't want to put that stuff in like my regular notes book. So now I've got two of these notebooks kind of that I'm carting around, and just for me, like, didn't work. So I had this ongoing Word doc. I'd put the date, and it started off just kind of, like, how am I feeling right now? There wasn't really questions. The questions really came into when I hit the wall of like, I know this stuff is really good for me. Like, I feel good after writing, but like, what do I write about now? Right? Like sometimes I'd be on a blog and I'd pull a quote, and literally the quote would be like the topic for the morning. And like, hey, what does that mean? And like, what can I get out of that? Then the questions really came in. And that's why we're really centering around questions, because something I say all the time, and if I reflect back, like this was really important, was people have a very different relationship to a question based on who's asking it.
Right.
I can ask myself a question, which is fine, and I think everyone should have some sort of self-reflection. But if Tim Ferriss or Chase Jarvis, like in my world where, I really believe in what they're doing and their path, if they're now asking the question, now all of a sudden, like, my reflection's up at a whole other level, right? Like, I'm taking it a little bit more seriously, or even though it could be this exact same question, but it's coming with context, right? So, then it just kept evolving. So Word doc, then it went into, at that time, I guess probably like Apple Notes was starting to come out, or some of the more cloud-based stuff. So I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool, because now I can literally pop something in on my phone and then it's synced up to my computer at the end of the day and all that stuff. Then I started trying some of the journaling apps that were out there, which, I mean, they're good. It's just like anyone that creates their own company, it's not what I wanted. Right. We really set out to...
So what was missing then? I'm curious.
I think just moving away from like something that felt like a word processor, and definitely wanted something that was like, our branding guidelines are based on this watch brand called Nomos, a German watch brand, very minimalistic, kind of modern face, like subtle hits of color, very thin lines. Like, anyone that's listening, if you look up the watches, you'll immediately see the color palettes and stuff like that. So we had them. We had Moo, the business card guys out in the UK. Same thing, like fun, punchy colors, but little hits here and there. And we just wanted to create something that was kind of designed first, that reflected our generation, right? Because again, like I said, these practices are archaic. They're like, they've been around for thousands of years. So for me, the practice itself is proven. Like, nothing stays around that long if it's useless. So then why isn't everyone using it? Like, why is it we're just finding out that Ray Dalio's like meditating for the last 25 years, and we're kind of just hearing about this stuff. And Tim's been talking about, talk about Tim as if he's my friend, but it's like the warped of social media world that we live in. So Mr. Tim Ferriss, he's been talking about just writing for years now, but all of them, right? So, if you have like millions of people listening to those podcasts and trying to like suck out all the information, it's only a matter of time before people are really going to pick it up. It's just like we're trying to accelerate that a little bit.
That's awesome.
Right? And just find something that works for you.
And that last part is so important, right? Like, as I think back about how I started my reflection practice, it started off with writing in a book, and like at the time, I didn't have any questions. I didn't know what to write, and I was given this advice to just try it out, and like to just genuinely give it a real genuine effort. So I did very ad hoc, like it wasn't scheduled, like you know how you're talking about how you do it every morning, like mine was just like once, it may have been once every 3 or 4 months in like my early entries. And then I migrated onto the phone where I put it onto Apple Notes and got digital, and then OneNote, and then Keo, and then I started doing some vlog stuff. I've been trying different things out. But I think, you know, regardless of, you know, which path, you know, if anyone listening that you take to start, what tools, what workflows you want to use, I think, you know, one of the principles that, and I believe in, and I think I heard from you, is, you know, to remove as much friction as possible, to make it as easy as possible to start, because this does feel somewhat unnatural. At least for me it did, right? It felt weird to capture my thoughts in some form. So, you know, if I were to, you know, suggest like a guiding principle for anyone to start, it really comes down to removing as much friction as possible, making it as easy as possible to get started. I think that's so important, and I think that's something you're trying to do with Keo as well, making it contextual, making it, you know, design first principles, right? Like you want to make it friendly, you want to increase, like you want to make it in such a way that, you know, people actually want to do it. And it sounds like that's something that you really value as well. Yeah,
like I think for me, and even this podcast, the whole purpose on our side of Keo Conversations is really like, I couldn't care less what you're using. It's really to stimulate reflection. And if we say something, or if there's one question that's left with a guess, or piece of a story that like, oh yeah, I can relate to that, then to me, I feel like, you know, we've done our job. So I agree with you, and I agree, like, set yourself up for success. It's just like you hear this often about physical exercise, right? Like people that get up in the morning, like they lay out their gym clothes, right? So that there's just no barriers. Like get out of the bed, your clothes are there, put them on, away you go. So I'd kind of take that even a step further with, I think if it's for the morning, and I think there's strong arguments to do this in the morning, just you have a way higher probability of succeeding and not pushing it out of the day if you do it in the morning. But set up, like pick your time, whatever it is to start. Like for me, I'm about an hour and a half every morning of some sort of priming. Let's just call it that. Steal some stuff from Tony Robbins. So the reason I say priming is because that involves exercise, that involves a steamer, so like some hot cold therapy. That could involve writing, that could involve podcasts, that could be, like I'm saying could because I know every morning on average I have an hour and a half for me to get my mind and body ready for the day. And I think that's important because it doesn't set hard rules that like every day I have to write. Like I don't write every day. Or every day I have to meditate, for example, right? Like even today I went to the gym with the intention the night before, I'm like, I'm going to do a spin class like through Aptiv, which is a great app if anyone wants to use that. I got to I'm like, I didn't really feel that. You know, I'd rather do like a weight workout and listen to a podcast. And it was great. It was a great podcast. Lewis House.
So, you know, you mentioned the podcast earlier, a Keo Conversation. So, you know, for the folks listening who are, you know, whether they're really accelerating their career, whether they're joining a high growth startup, whether they're starting their own business or managing an existing business, I'd love to hear how reflection has helped you throughout that journey from, you know, coming up with the idea to leaving your full-time job. And I know there's a story around that about why that was such an interesting and, you know, maybe scary but exciting moment for you, to, you know, building the product, to launching the podcast, to, I believe what you described on another show that, you know, what you're trying to do is build a wellness company. So I'm curious to hear how reflection has, you know, guided you throughout that journey on both a personal and professional perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's been everything. Like you know, in my original job, I remember going through, not the last company I was at, but I remember going through situations where, you know, I was interviewing actually to leave the country and start a job in the US, and got to kind of the very end of the process, and long story short, couldn't get a visa to the US, to the point where like relocation companies were calling to set up like the move. So like mentally I was there. right? But never ended up getting there. That was a big blow, right? So I remember I was in Boston about to give a talk in front of a whole team at the existing job, and had to flip a switch. Like, I just got the email saying, like, it's not going to happen. And I remember writing that out in, I think it was Apple Notes at the time, and just kind of unloading, like almost like grieving, the situation. Like, this sucks. And I'll never forget this. I finished it off with a gratitude practice, and I'm like, here I am. I'm in a pretty nice hotel. The lights are on. I'm eating. I have it could be a hell of a lot worse, right? Like, there's people in countries and all around the world that, that is not the situation, right? So I think it pulls you out of any current situation and grounds you. So, that's how I was using it in the past. And then for Keo, just to launch, I use it today, like, daily. And not just Keo, meditate, all of these practices. Like, I feel so blessed to be able to sit with people like yourself and the hundreds of others that we've interviewed to understand, like, wow, what do you do to stay sane and at the top of your game? Because honestly, we wouldn't have, I don't think the product would be out without that. Okay. And to continue, right?
So I gotta ask, how about making the decision when you took the leap? I think you were having your firstborn on the way. Like, how was that like, and how did reflection make it easier or help facilitate that decision?
Yeah, that was a big one. I would say above that, though, to be honest with you, was the fact that I was partnering up with my brother-in-law, and who was the co-founder, Sine Shah. Because I remember we were at a conference together, and the decision was made, and we came back, and we had like the meeting with the wives type thing, because we had been working on all this, right, in the evenings and weekends and stuff like that. So, we're going to give this a full go. And so step one was kind of that blessing. But then it sets in like, wow, like, I've been in this whole other world for 10 years, and this is kind of scary. And it's like, in retrospect, you hear this all the time. Had we known how hard it would be, probably wouldn't do it, to be honest. So it's like a bit of that naive kind of thought process that I think everyone needs to start even your podcast, right? Like,
oh, for sure.
Right. I'm sure it's the same thing. It's like, wow, these things are a lot of work. And there's a lot of behind the scenes. So, yeah. So, that was the biggest question, I think, that in terms of reflection was, I just asked myself, what's the worst that can happen? And I knew that there was two things. I knew that I would regret not doing it, and I didn't want to live like that. And B, the worst case scenario, it fails, like air quotes fails, because I still to this day believe there is no failure as long as you're learning something. I could always go back into that industry, either at that same company or another company. Like, I wasn't leaving on bad terms. I had great experience. I just literally got something on LinkedIn the other day, like, hey, do you miss pharmaceutical advertising? And I'm like, not really, but miss the people. So like the jobs are there, right? So like, what is the worst? Because we fabricate a lot of our own worries.
Yeah. And I think that's where a practice of reflection has really helped me, right? Really, again, like the big, main reason of why I reflect often is, I'm more due to my analytical mind and, looking backwards and thinking, thoughts, decisions, emotions, actions, whatnot. And, that fear question always comes up, and it really comes down to, like, what is the worst case? Like, am I actually afraid, or like, is it a fabricated, expectation I'm giving myself? Like, where is this coming from? And I think taking the time to stop and think about it is something that I didn't do. I think it's something that a lot of people didn't do, especially in today's world. Like, we're always on, there's always something going on, there's Netflix and sports and blah blah blah. And I think just taking a moment to think, like, you don't even necessarily have to write it down per se, but just having a prompt to think, think. I think questions are a brilliant way to facilitate that internal discussion in your head. It's so important in all of these decisions, right? So like, I totally agree with you on that.
But your brain needs to rest too, right? Like
Yeah.
we're all very familiar and kind of attuned to physical exercise, and that, if you're cranking away at like whatever it is, running or the gym, like nonstop all the time, like eventually you have to rest your body, right? It's no different with your mind, right? So like I was coming downtown today for meetings, and I was on a streetcar, and normally like the old Marc, and I still struggle with this, would have been like, perfect, I'm going to cram in a podcast, right? Great time. I'm like going to be 15 minutes on the streetcar. Kind of what I'm trying to do now is, you know what? I'm going to get my podcast in. I got it in at the gym, but like maybe just 15 minutes of nothing and just actually looking out the window of the streetcar and seeing what's going on is a better use of time. So, which is hard, right? And even myself, I struggle with that. I'd be like, I could be reviewing something and popping, something out on Basecamp or replying to the email. But I think as soon as you start realizing that 15 minutes for yourself actually equates to much more, right, on the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and it's hard. I can totally
really hard.
relate with you on that one. So I want to dive into some of the specifics and mechanics now, right?
Yeah.
So for the folks listening who like up until now they've heard of the benefits of why reflection is important.
Sure.
All the thought leaders are also doing it, and so now we've piqued their interest. So now in terms of hopefully, and now in terms of the mechanics and strategies, like, what are some specific things that someone should consider when starting out, right? Like some of the immediate questions I can think of is, I don't know what to write. I don't know why. So we talked about the why, but maybe it's just about, like, do I need to do it every day? Do I need to have a routine? Do I need to have a set objective? Do I need to have my tools figured out? What book do I use? Blah, blah, blah. Like, what are some strategies you encourage people to think about to get started?
Just start.
Mm-hmm.
I think we hear that a lot in the entrepreneurial world, right? Like you can kind of, you can kind of drown yourself in the details, right? So, for example, like if you think you're going out and buying like a physical notebook that like looks great and you're going to feel good kind of writing in it, will help, then go get that. But usually that's not the thing. So, I would just say just start. So take something as simple as, we brush our teeth every morning, right? Mm-hmm. So just try one while you're brushing your teeth. The good old dentists say we should at least brush for 2 minutes, right? So that's plenty of time to reflect a bit.
Right.
So when you're brushing your teeth, just ask one question, and you can do this twice a day, actually, if you're doing it, brushing your teeth twice a day, which hopefully. I think most of us are doing, I hope. So the morning prompt would be, what would make today great? And just think about what's kind of coming up in your day. I'm sure you have somewhat idea of like maybe meetings you have or encounters or things you want to accomplish, like, and just pick something that, that would make it great. And it doesn't mean like, I'm going to try to avoid the to-do list stuff. Like making today great would be like cranking out 10 things off my to-do list. No, like something I'm going to be on the Canvas series, like I'm going to bring my whole self to that and just like really engage and feel good about it. Like that's what I would say, for example. And then same thing at night, like what made you smile today? Right? Or what was something that was awesome that happened, and just keep it light. And I think at least it gets you started. And like I said, now I know if I like the days I can't do the morning reflection or that priming time, it only takes a day or two for me to actually start to physically feel the drawbacks of not doing that.
Right.
So for me, I always try to, like, on the reflection side of things, again, it goes to that theme of don't set yourself up for failure, right? Like, so if you're thinking that you need to take 30 minutes to do this, you're probably not going to do it, right? Because it's hard to find 30 minutes, at least to start. Eventually, I think people will get there. So then just set it up in your day. Like if you have a commute, take that commute time and think or write. The guys at Bear and Fig, Joey, they sell awesome notebooks, and that's what he does. He's in New York, from his apartment in New York, right to Queens, where their office is. He's writing in his journal every morning. So like it has to work for you, right?
Yeah. I love that, right? And I think, with the toothbrushing example, I can't remember how many days you need to do something to build a habit.
Yeah.
But I think having some sort of trigger, having some sort of thing that you think, like, once you associate when X happens, I should reflect, I should pause for a moment, I should do some writing, or I should just think and ask myself a question. Yeah. I know for myself, I am definitely, I do a bit of reflection in the morning when I set kind of like my intention for the day, like what is something
Sure.
I have to get done today. Today was, really bringing the heat for this episode. Like that was fun as well. Sure. And then at night I do the same thing. And, for me in particular, and, this might just be for me in that sense, but, I'm putting it in my calendar, right? So then, for instance, every night at 11:30, my phone has a little, like it buzzes, and I'm like, oh, like what's going on? And then it reminds me to reflect, and that's my trigger. That reminds me, okay, like what, now is time to stop and shut everything down, start to wind down, take a moment to reflect and whatnot. And for me, designing that kind of alert, designing that kind of structured system in my life helped me develop a habit, which now it's a very automatic behavior. Like I still have the notification thing with the calendar event there, but nowadays it's whenever I go to sleep, before I go to sleep, it's just natural.
Yeah. Speaking of sleep, though, something that I can't remember where I picked this up. It's guaranteed from an interview on our side. And this is fun. So everyone's going to sleep, obviously. Some people have a hard time falling asleep, so this could help as well. It's a great time to do some visualization. And I remember, I think it was 2 people I interviewed who brought this up. It's super fun because now you start actually looking forward to going to sleep. So I always go back to, I have a goal sheet that I put together every year and kind of keep it up to date. And then under that, I always have a vision board, which is, again, all digital. They're just images of feelings that, that I want to feel. It could be images of houses, of like what would be a great feeling or whatever. Like sometimes they're materialistic things, but it doesn't matter. It's the feeling that it gives off. So when I go to sleep, I'll go to that visual. And like, okay, I'm there, I'm in that space. Or in like Kiyo's case, it's like, our team is growing. It's like we have our own office, like everyone's happy, like that's kind of what I'm visualizing in that capacity. If I'm going down that route, usually it's more personal, but that's fun. It's fun because I agree with the guests that we had on the show. They said like you get excited to go to sleep for that stuff, right? Because you're kind of going in this. There's no rules, right? It's imagination. And then on that, there's a cool writing exercise too. And Debbie Millman is the first I heard this from, and Tim Ferriss interviewed her about this. And she does these 10-year writing visualizations. So, she'll say like, in 10 years, how will my life look and feel? And just go and just write whatever you can think of, for example. And you don't have to do 10 years. I've done it, a year out. I do it every month now. So we're getting close to August, and August 1st, I'll write out as if it's August 31st, for example, and write in that tense, like, amazing. We did this, we did that. And it's amazing how much of that stuff comes true.
I love that. And, while I've never written about it, I have thought ahead 5-10 years down the road and beyond. And I think there's always an interesting point where your first minute or 2 minutes or whatever, you're thinking like the most logical things. I think we're wired to think incremental
you gotta
steps.
get rid of that.
All right, well, 10 years from now, I'll have a family, I have kids. And then once you kind of break that, what I would call like your logical thinking phase, and you kind of enter your creative, because then like you've exhausted all the logical things that could realistically happen. I think once you kind of get over that cliff, you start to think of some wild things, right? Like, could I actually go to this part of the world? Could I actually build a business? Like things that you wouldn't have imagined in your logical step. Yeah. I think that's when it gets really interesting, because then you learn to have fun with it. And I think too often we stop at that point. Like we've exhausted all the logical ideas, we've exhausted all the logical thoughts when we're reflecting and journaling, and then we don't go beyond that. And I think it's really beyond that horizon is when we get those interesting, creative, out of the box thinking that I think, and I think it's also important to A, not take yourself so seriously, and B, to entertain it. Like to actually entertain this idea, like what if I actually did that? And then you start to work backwards and you quickly realize it's not that outrageous when you really think about it, right? So
I'll give you an example that actually came true recently this year. I had put on this image of this like super trendy kind of, it had like the giant green wall thing going on and all the plants and stuff and like this cool trendy seating. It was this big open space and this little bar, and it just, for me, the reason I put the image on, it's just, again, straight kind of Google image search, right? And I can't remember what I would have typed, or maybe it was out of Dwell or something. Mm-hmm. And the feeling was like, oh wow, I mean, if we're, can have a meeting there or something, like things would be going pretty good and all of that. And no idea what the space was. 2 months later, I've talked about this on the show before, but we went on this all men's retreat and had an incredible time and brand new experiences, met some of these awesome people. And one of the founders of the Everyman retreat said, I heard you're in New York, you're coming to New York in a couple weeks, let's meet up and all that. And I had meetings booked. He's like, meet me here at this place. So I look up the location. It's that exact place on my vision board.
That's crazy.
You got to be kidding me, right? Like, I had no idea what that location was, and so I'm walking. So I took a photo of like off my own phone when I got there, and like, well, here it is. So I removed the image, put something else on. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But like, I don't know how to explain that stuff, but it works. Again, for me, it started back when I started doing those morning routines, because again, fueling my mind with positive things and following all these people that you start hearing about these type of practices, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And that's how it started. That's how Keo started, to be very honest with you, because I review that goal sheet and that vision board every Christmas with my father-in-law. And 2 years ago, we reviewed it, and he's like, everything looks good, but what you're doing career-wise doesn't match what's on your sheet. Mm-hmm. And we just kind of left it at that. And like, that's an interesting comment.
Interesting.
And then that was in December, and then in January the idea for Keo came up.
Interesting.
And I remember thinking, I'm like, I wonder if maybe that's what he's talking about. And here we are.
So you talked about, your reflection practice when you first started, and I think something you've also mentioned in the past was how our reflection practices should evolve with us, right?
Yeah.
So curious to hear, for anyone wondering now, okay, so now that I've started this practice, now that I've created a system that works for them, how can they evolve it? Like, what things should they look out for in their life, in their career, in their business, relationship, whatever it is, and how do they make sure that their reflection practice aligns with that or evolves with it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'm a bit biased here because that's actually why we created Keo. So this is not a shameless plug, but wherever you're getting your inspiration from, like, that's what you should be reflecting on. So, mm-hmm. I mean, there are great templates out there. There are great prompts. Let's use, what am I grateful for as an example. I mean, you can't go wrong answering a question like that. But if you're answering that same question every single day, I'm willing to bet that after a certain amount of time, you're going to say my family, my health, and my surroundings. Mm-hmm. And like over and over again, right? So there's ways to kind of combat that let's get a little bit more detailed or more granular. But for me, it's changing the question, like having a gratitude theme, for example. But that's where, what we're trying to do with these interviews, and I'm going to ask for your questions. That's where changing the questions keeps it alive. Because again, I think there's a theme developing in our conversation is like, don't set yourself up for failure. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to do the same thing over and over again, that's good for developing a habit, but you might get bored of it, right? So keep it fresh. And my argument is always, our life this month is probably going to be very different next month.
Right.
So should our questions. Right?
Yeah.
That's why we should be evolving, and also why probably apps like Headspace and Calm and others are creating all these different categories for meditation. Right. I use a host of those apps, but if I'm thinking of Headspace right now, I've got a few packs on the go, right? Focus, motivation, stress. Like one day I'm going to need the stress pack, right? So I'm going to go in there and do that meditation.
For sure.
And, tomorrow I might do motivation. I don't know, right?
For sure. And that's important, right? I think, in addition to keeping it fresh, I know for myself, again, tying back to why I reflect, it's to analyze, to think.
Sure.
So depending on what is going on in my life right now, it prompts me to think of certain things, right? So, around April, May this year, I definitely entered, into a state of like burnout. I was exhausted, I was stressed, I was, letting go of certain practices. Like I wasn't working out consistently, I wasn't meditating consistently. Like everything started to fall apart. So I caught on to that, and then that's when I adjusted my questions, and I purposely adjusted my questions to, and like I'll share my now common questions, the ones I use now. But at the time, I reframed my questions that align back to my own values, right? Because I think at the end of the day, your individual values guide your day-to-day, guides your thoughts, it guides your decisions and actions. So for me at the time, it was going back to, okay, so what are my core values and how do I remind myself those? Because I think bringing back to your why is what keeps you going. It's what kind of brings you back out. It gives you that energy. So like for me, a big core value for myself is learning. So I just ask myself, okay, so what is one, no matter how big or small thing that I learned today, or how was I intentional today, or how did I practice patience and presence today, how did I challenge myself today? Those are my core values. How did I contribute to society, or how did I help someone today? Like an act of service is another core value. So I tie it back to my core values when I'm burning out, and then right now as I'm back out, it's kind of like, okay, so what are my questions right now? And again, it evolves. Like as I come out of burnout, I'm building so much momentum. I'm fired up. There's a lot of things in the pipeline. I have a lot of things going on. So a big question for me right now is, what am I like excited for?
So these are your questions?
Yeah. Okay. So what am I excited for? And I ask these at night just to give you some context. So what am I excited for tomorrow? So similar to your practice, I like to go to bed fired up. And I wake up fired up too, which is amazing, right? I also ask myself, what did I do today that I'm really proud of? So it reinforces confidence. It reinforces that like I'm doing the right thing. I'm being intentional. Another question I ask is, what is the big thought or decision or action that I made today? And it really, makes sure that I think back, like what is something, like it prompts me to be present in the moment, because every single day as I make these big thoughts, as I make these big decisions, I try to be as present as possible so I remember them. Like what are the big ones that I made that day? So those are the big ones. And I think another one I also ask is, how did I practice humility today? Because as I do all these things, and this was more prominent, recently than it is right now, but I caught myself in these meetings with these high-level CEOs and executives, and they would say things, and I pull the and like I have no idea what they're saying. So how did I remind myself to practice humility and be, and not be afraid to ask questions, right? So those are some of the questions right now, and to your point, I'm sure 3, 4, 5 months from now, depending on where I am, what's going on, my questions will evolve as well. My system, my practice will evolve as well. And I think that's so important. And that's what I love about what you're doing at Keo. It's that it's dynamic. It grows with you. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, no, and thanks for sharing those. I mean, those are great. I mean, I think I'll be using one of these actually, especially the what am I excited for tomorrow? I like that. Because I think, and then especially the other one I really like is just, a decision that you made. Because that's it. I have a practice every Friday at 3 p.m. where I just reflect back on the week that just passed before moving into the weekend. Is what I find is, like, we can buy a lot of the books and listen to a lot of the podcasts, which we both do. But at the end of the day, we also have a lot of the answers. Right. And like, there's a lot that happens in 5 days, right? And there's a lot that happens in 1 day if you stop and think about it, right? So that's the key. Like, we actually have our own answers to a lot of these questions, and these self-development type questions or practices, again, just stopping to think, okay, well, what did we actually achieve today, or where would we have changed, right? And then all of a sudden you're growing as a person just with a couple simple questions, right?
That's awesome. So as we come to the end of this conversation, I'd love to hear from you. What is one actionable piece of advice that everyone listening can implement today to really design a practice of reflection in their life?
Yeah, well, I mean, the brushing the teeth one, I think, is usually the go-to, because I think that's something everyone can relate to. But just to be fair to the question, since I already brought that up, I love how your calendar just says eat. He is really systematized. It's amazing. One would be just prioritize some time, whether it's the morning or the end of day. That's, I think, the easiest way to get started. And again, don't set yourself up to fail. Don't prioritize 2 hours, because it's just not going to happen, right? Even myself, I put a goal in this year of just reading completely outside of app related things, or just read.
Right.
It could be fiction or it could be just development in other ways. And I remember I put in there reading 30 minutes a day or something. And again, my father-in-law's you're setting yourself up to fail. That's, you kind of add it up to start, that might be a lot. Or I think I put 45 minutes. He's just put 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Right? So it kind of goes back to my point. Just pick whatever it is. Maybe it is just 10 minutes and you get up and you're literally just stretching in the morning and taking in a couple deep breaths and setting an intention of some sort. Today I'm going to rock, or I'm going to really get the most out of today and start the day. Just doing that, you're going to start feeling so much better. That's what I love about all this. I mean, there's so much science behind it, but at the end of the day, and coming from someone that worked in a lot of science when it came to pharmaceuticals, you just feel better. Nothing, what else do you need? You're feeling better, right? So that would be my kind of go-to practical. Start with 10 minutes.
I love that. Start with 10 minutes. I would even build on that. I would say, my actionable piece of advice on top of start with 10 minutes is to find your anchor, find your trigger, find that thing that when you see it, when you notice it, when you acknowledge it's happening or it's there, that you go okay, now it's 10 minutes on to reflection. I think whether it's brushing your teeth, whether it's before you go to bed, whatever it is, when you drink a glass of water in the morning, whatever. I think that trigger and that removing friction, those two principles is really, I think, what we both align on during this conversation.
Well, just tie it to something that you're already doing.
Right.
Like you said, drinking water in the morning. So if I think most people do that, right? So if you're doing that, add in your time, your reflection time around that period, right?
Yeah.
And again, you don't want to feel I have to add an hour into my schedule.
Yeah, it shouldn't be a chore.
Right? Exactly. Or I have to get up earlier to do this. If it's 10 minutes, it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Right? So.
All right, Marc.
Cool.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for a great episode.
Yeah, that was fun.
That was awesome.
Hey everybody, it's Raf here, and thank you so much for listening to the Canvas series. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave a rating and a review. As well, please share this with one person who you believe will absolutely benefit from this conversation. The Canvas series is all about content and community, and we absolutely need your help in getting the message out there. As well, feel free to follow along on social media at canvas.series for everyday discussions and content. Until next time, my friends.